Please welcome back Dr. Donald Sweeting, Colorado Christian University President.
Well, good evening, everybody. What an inspiring, energetic day. Are you full? Do you have room for more? I hope so. I want to speak with you this evening about our theme for the Western Conservative Summit, the theme of fortifying freedom. Some of the last words spoken at the 2017 Western Conservative Summit were spoken by that British analyst who loves America, Os Guinness. He ended his address saying the deepest crisis in America today is not between Republican or Democrat, not between conservative or liberal, not between globalism and nationalism, but between the heirs and allies of 1776, i.e. the American Revolution, and the heirs and allies of 1789, i.e. the French Revolution. He said the great issue and question of our time is freedom, and what kind of freedom we'll live under. So I've been thinking about this, wrestling with it. How do we fortify the kind of 1776 freedom? That's the freedom that was there at the beginning. The American Revolution and the French Revolution are a study in contrast. Two revolutions, two views of freedom. They had something in common. Both were democratic revolutions. Both dismantled the old order of monarchy. Both were influenced by the Enlightenment. But they had profound differences. They had a different view of liberty. The French Revolution's view of liberty was liberty as absolute autonomy. Liberty apart from God. The American Revolution had a liberty that was an ordered liberty, a liberty under transcendent norms and traditions, a liberty under God. In fact, you could sort of crudely characterize the difference in the revolutions this way. 1789, the French Revolution, influenced by a radical Enlightenment. 1776, the American Revolution, influenced by the conservative Enlightenment. 1789, they pushed the separation of God and state. 1776, it was about the separation of a national church and state. 1789 was statist. 1776 spoke about limited government. 1789 pushed violently against the Christian faith. 1776 was shaped by the Christian faith. 1789 was a prototype for later utopian and communist revolutions. 1776 was a prototype of constitutional government and democracy. 1789 ended in a reign of terror and a dictator named Napoleon. 1776 ended in a constitutional government that has lasted almost 250 years and brought the blessings of liberty to the world. That's the difference. Edmund Burke, the British statesman and the father of the modern conservative movement, wrote a book in 1790 called Reflections on the French Revolution. And he actually supported the emancipation of the American colonies, but he opposed the ravages of the French Revolution with its armed doctrine. He said it was a phenomenon of a totally new kind. He said that it was based on a theory and progressive philosophy that was deeply flawed in its view of God, flawed in its view of state, flawed in its view of religion, flawed in its use of abstract reason to direct the course of society, reason alone, flawed in its view of humanity, and flawed in its view of freedom as an absolute liberty. Arnold Toynbee, the great historian, said the French Revolution involved the fanatical worship of human power. Why does this matter, you say? 1968. 1968 is a year that is now seared in the American conscience. It was a year of revolution. This summer we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the summer of '68. That was a year that saw political revolutions in Europe, Paris, Berlin, and London. It was a year in which that same spirit of revolution came to the United States with riots in major American cities and unrest and protests on almost all the major college campuses. 50 years later, 1968 looms large as a year initiating a massive cultural, political, and moral change in our country. And looking back from our perspective, we look at it as a kind of turning point in history. It was the beginning of a moral and cultural revolution. I look at it as a kind of mini French Revolution that happened on American soil and pushed the 1789 kind of freedom. It was a revolt against the American order and the Western order. They began to talk about deconstructing Western civilization and its value system. There was a deliberate rejection of our Jewish and Christian roots. After the 60s, the left began saying that the founders were no longer relevant, the Constitution could be changed in its meaning, the Declaration was not that important. It was driven by a destructive and nihilistic relativism. 1968, and you say, well, why does that matter? Fast forward 50 years later, and here we are. And you can see the outworking of this cultural revolution on our universities, in our schools, on our families, and in our culture. And so Ozgin's question is a relevant one. What kind of freedom will we embrace? The freedom of 1789 or the freedom of 1776? As for me and my house, I know which kind of freedom leads to prosperity and life. It's the freedom of 1776. And it caused me to ask another question, a practical question. Then how do we fortify this kind of freedom in our day? Fortifying freedom takes a plan. We need a freedom plan. I often think we don't have a freedom plan. We need a freedom plan that involves politics but goes way beyond politics, a plan that goes deeper than politics, that will start to restore the foundations of a free society, that will transmit values intentionally to the younger generation so that they're embraced and they're lived out. How will we do this? We must do this, but how? I'd like to suggest a starting point, a few starting points, steps towards a freedom plan. The first thing I think we have to do is to restock our memories. You can't make America great again unless you go back to what made her great in the first place, right? You have to go back. And one of the greatest challenges of our time is that progressive ideology wants to sweep away history, American history, Western history, Christian history. And by the way, this is one of the differences between the conservative and the progressive. One wants to abandon the past. The other wants to preserve that heritage. The past is generally irrelevant for the progressive because it's all about the future and the present. They're ashamed of our history, Western history, American history, the Founding Fathers, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. We need to begin by restocking our memories. You say, how? Teaching history, for one, teaching political history, economic history, American history, Western history. We ignore the past, and you can see it in this generation's students. They don't know about their past. And then along with that, to restock our memory, we must tell stories. Tell stories by venerating heroes, not as perfect people, but as courageous people. People like the Pilgrims and Whitefield and Washington in 1783 and Paul Revere and Patrick Henry and many, many others. We must get back to telling our stories and pass them on. We restock our memory by teaching the Declaration and the Constitution, our national covenant. There was a poll among young people recently, and it said they don't know or even value the First Amendment. What's happened? What's happened? In the chaotic Middle Ages, monasteries sprang up all over Europe. They were planted in dark pagan forests in Germany, Ireland, and England, and they were outposts of memory to keep learning alive. A sacred transmission took place, which was vital for the rebirth of Western civilization. We begin our freedom plan by restocking our memories. We must do that. Secondly, our freedom plan must teach virtue. Freedom requires virtue. Our founders said if we turn away from moral law, we will forfeit the blessings of liberty. Our system is a system of self-government. Ben Franklin said only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. I'm not talking simply about values, but virtues and vices that we teach. Right and wrong, good and evil. Not simply 12 rules for life, as helpful as they may be, but 10 commandments that are true for all time. We must teach virtue as part of our plan to restore the foundations. And then thirdly, we must encourage faith. Faith in God. Alexis de Tocqueville, a Frenchman who came to America and observed her greatness, said, "Liberty cannot be established without morality and without faith. Virtue requires faith." John Adams said, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It's wholly inadequate for the government of any other." Our nation was created in the fear of God. And if you put God over all, you'll be amazed at how many other things fall into place. Encourage faith. Faith in God. Faith that turns to the Bible, the book that created Western civilization. Faith that leads us to prayer, to pray for our nation, to pray for others, to pray for awakening and revival. That's key to restoring freedom of the 1776 kind. And then finally, in the beginning of my freedom plan, I'll put, we must build mediating institutions. You say, what are mediating institutions? That's a phrase used to describe smaller forms of human association that stand between the individual and the huge impersonal state. Pre-political institutions that are the foundation of civil society, from which conservative thought naturally arises. They are value-forming and generating agencies. Mediating institutions, you say, like what? Like volunteer associations, but especially the family as a mediating institution. The family, the smallest, most vital unit. The family, the first school, the first church, the first law court, the first economy, the first community, the first bank, the first hospital that any human being ever encounters. Families based on God's design. Families which the early Presbyterians said are the seminary of the church and the state. Families where you have children and you are there for your children, guiding them, and you stick together for life, and you encourage policies that will encourage that kind of strong family. That's huge for freedom in the future and restoring freedom of the 1776 kind. But let me mention two other mediating institutions that you should think about. Secondly, houses of faith. Now, as a Christian, I speak of the church as a house of faith. It's been the beating heart of our culture. It's an incubator of faith. It teaches transcendence, permanent things, God's law, the order of created reality, God's holiness, God's love, divine accountability, God's ultimate judgment. We need to work so that churches are healthy and thriving and free. It's so vital for our country and for the 1776 kind of freedom. Eugene Peterson said the church is the institution God has set at the center of the world to keep the world centered. That's part of my freedom plan. I think it's key to a 1776 kind of freedom. But the final kind of mediating institution that's important is to build solid schools. Not just any schools, but good schools. Elementary and secondary. Sometimes it means restoring schools that have drifted, but often starting new alternative schools. Schools that teach morals and manners. Schools that teach history, that aren't ashamed of our nation's past. Schools that teach English Lit and geography and basic grammar and basic math and basic science. That's huge for the kind of freedom we're talking about. And then universities and colleges that are rightly ordered and religiously informed, that have core curriculums, that teach noble virtues, that are immersed in the history of Western civilization, that teach Plato and Aristotle and Homer and Dante and Shakespeare and Bible and theology, that teach students about permanent things. Anthony Esolen, wise academic that he is, said it's not enough to reform the old schools. Many are beyond reforming, But he said, ultimately, we must build new colleges. That's an absolute necessity. So mediating institutions are part and must be part of this plan. Mediating institutions, de Tocqueville said, they are the bulwark of freedom against the encroaching power of the state. Without them, a powerful state steps in, and these institutions, these mediating institutions, basically, they promote limited government by holding back the state. Mediating institutions where conservatives are made, because only as these are strong will we see people raised up to embrace the 1776 kind of freedom. Modern American conservatives are dedicated to the task of this tradition of liberty. We are keepers of the flame of liberty, but to do this, it requires a more robust freedom plan than we have. It requires a plan like I've just said, and many other things as well. Because freedom, friends, is not a cliche, it's a precious gift that must be fortified. In closing, I want to say this. Let me remind you that there was also another revolution that started in the 1960s. It was a conservative revolution. There were people like William F. Buckley and Russell Kirk and Ronald Reagan himself who started speaking out at that time because they knew what was coming. And at that time, Reagan left us with these powerful words. He said, "Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We don't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. Or one day," he said, "we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States where men were free." Ladies and gentlemen, we must fortify freedom.